David, it's just you and me. Hi everybody. Thank you for coming. How about a hand for the band? And I'm going to read you their bios just so you have this. Bob Braylow, where'd he go? There he is. A musician, composer, and producer who has worked extensively with Stevie Wonder and the Grateful Dead and has also written songs for the Dead. He is known for his mind-bending contributions to the drums and space sections of the Dead's live shows and is the producer of the recording Infrared Roses. He lives in San Francisco. Bob. David Gans, next to me here, well, a few chairs over, is a musician, author, and radio host, and a trusted member of the band's extended family. He has produced so much. Box sets, compilations, tribute albums for the Dead. He's published 5 books about the band, most recently, Improvised Lives, Grateful Dead, 1972-1985. He is co-host of the weekly Sirius talk show, Tales from the Golden Road, and he lives in Oakland. David Gans. And this is kind of, this show is like a rogues gallery of Grateful Dead experts. You guys are so lucky. This is such a treat. Okay, there we go. Okay, so who wants to come out first? Okay, Amelia Davis. Here's Amelia. She is the owner of Jim Marshall Photography, LLC, and was Jim's longtime personal assistant. Following his death in 2010, she has edited 6 Jim Marshall monographs, curated yearly photographic exhibitions of his work, and was executive producer of the 2019 documentary film, Show Me the Picture, the story of Jim Marshall. She has also released 3 of her own photography books, and she is based in San Francisco, and these are photos from the book. Nice. Amelia Davis. All right, Dennis McNally next. Dennis is a journalist and an author and was the Dead's publicist for more than 20 years. His books include biographies of Jack Kerouac, which is brilliant, and The Grateful Dead, a collection of Jerry Garcia interviews, and most recently, The Last Great Dream, How Bohemians Became Hippies and Created the 60s. He is a longtime resident of San Francisco. Dennis McNally. And finally, Jim Newton is a writer and a journalist specializing in California history and politics. He's the author of 5 books. He grew up in Palo Alto, home of the Grateful Dead. He teaches at UCLA, and his most recent book is Here Beside the Rising Tide, a biography of Jerry Garcia. He lives in Pasadena. Jim Newton. So, books are for sale over here, in case anybody has not mentioned that 28 times. So everyone here will be available for signing books at intermission and also after the show. Yeah, Grateful Dead, 60 years. It's the fan base of the Grateful Dead is unlike any other band. It's continues on. And most of all of their peers do not have this rabid fan base that keeps, all of us talking about it still. Why do you suppose that is? Somebody please jump in.
Why don't you start with
Well, my standard remark on that is simply that the Grateful Dead did 2 things in particular. First, they weren't a rock band, they were a jazz band. They were an improvisational band. They used rock structures and instruments, but they improvised, which involves a leap of faith. You jump off a cliff. Sometimes it's you fly, and sometimes you end up on the rocks, and they did both. That's one, and in that invocation of risk is potential magic, and that's what they were about. That's A. B, they spent 2 months in late 1965 and early 1966 during the acid test in which they weren't the entertainment. the room, everybody in the room was the entertainment. Everybody in the room was entertained because you came in, you did acid, and you found out what was going on in your brain and in the room. And the point is that they, if they played, and they didn't always, they were the soundtrack, but they were not the entertainment. And for the next 30 years, at least that much, I mean, even when they were playing 60,000 people at Giant Stadium, there was that much where the attitude was that the audience was not the audience, you know, cows with wallets that could pay. The audience were their peers, were fellow questors, and it did, you know, I mean, it's not to say that there were times when a band member would go, you know, fucking audience, but the fact is, and I've heard it, but the fact is that they had a different attitude that made it unique, and that left them with to be the last band standing, and with the inheritance, the legacy of the San Francisco music scene, which involved a lot of very positive values, values that are still existent, even if not at the White House. And that's enough from me.
Can I take a stab at that?
Please.
All right, the Grateful Dead were, as Dennis says, they were a jazz band using folk and rock idioms as their vocabulary. The Grateful Dead combined a brilliant collection of original songs with brilliant interpretations of other people's songs and stitched it all together with improvisation, and did not play any song the same way twice. Our sociologist friend Rebecca Adams says this was a brilliant, if inadvertent, way of creating an audience that would stay with them. And Bill Graham told me once, you know, people don't age out of this one. Heavy metal fans, the hormones stop pumping and they move on to other music, but Grateful Dead fans stay with it. So we now are looking at, you know, groups of families of Deadheads that are 4 generations deep, because you don't age out of this when you stay with it and you bring your kids into it. And the music has propagated itself all over this planet, because guys like me started playing that music and found people to play that music with. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Grateful Dead tribute bands out there in the world playing those songs and having those jams in front of their community, which is a continuation of the one that the Grateful Dead started in 1965.
Yep.
Great. So let's dig into some of the books here. Amelia and David, there's a million music photographers throughout history, a lot of great ones in the Bay Area when Rolling Stone launched here and created a lot of careers with these photographers. What set Jim Marshall apart from the rest of these people?
He carried a gun.
He carried a gun. Did everyone hear that?
Sorry.
It's true.
We got 5 minutes into the show.
I think what set Jim Marshall apart from the other photographers is that his photos were taken as if you were there. So they never were set up or felt posed or manipulated in any way. Jim was part of the scene, and he was part of that, so as a viewer you feel like a participant rather than a voyeur looking in. And I think when Jim photographed the Grateful Dead, he became improvisational as much as they did, especially when they were playing live. So he was part of the band, but his instrument was the camera. And so he was able to kind of dance around with them on stage and capture that emotion and that feeling in those photographs when they were playing live. But also he was able to capture photographs of them at home, just hanging out. And Jim, I think that was his specialty, was really capturing these moments when people were unguarded and they didn't know he was there. And they were showing their humanity. They weren't these rock gods, you know, these icons. They were human. And Jim was able to show that in his photography. He was able to show the humanity of people. And that's why David and I love this book so much, I think, is because it shows that. It shows the Grateful Dead as people, and you as a viewer become part of their family. So you can look through the book and feel like you were there with them. And I think that's what really set Jim apart.
He was a brilliant photographer and a very aggressive person. And he had a way of getting to where he needed to be, regardless of casualties. But the magic of Jim was that he got there, and then he became invisible. You look at these pictures going by, and this guy, he did not use long lenses either. He used very short lenses, so he was in those musicians' faces during those shows and in those dressing rooms and stuff. And I knew Jim just well enough, as I wrote in the book, to know that all the nasty shit they said about him is true. Because he was that guy. It was very difficult to deal with in a lot of ways, but he was as much a genius in his field as these musicians were in theirs. And everybody knew that about him. He had that ability, he had that command of the situation to get himself where he needed to be and then to disappear and allow the moment to unfold of its own accord.
I would just like to comment that as the Grateful Dead's publicist, I am grateful to God and all the gods that he was not shooting the Grateful Dead when I was there, because theoretically I was supposed to keep things, you know, under control, and that was not going to happen with Jim. And you know, fortunately, he had at least stopped shooting very much when I started working. So.
One more thing about this is so great. We're learning so much about Jim Marshall's temper. He shot a ton of iconic images apart from the Grateful Dead. I mean, everyone has seen the Johnny Cash flipping the bird shot. Talk about the process of going through these images to try and find, to put this book together. Because
it was fun.
It was. It took us actually 3 years.
Wow.
And Jim, David and I looked through over 10,000 images of the Grateful Dead, black and white and color. And Jim was very organized. I know a lot of people think he was this gun-toting, coked-out guy who...
He was.
He was. But when it came to his photography, he was extremely organized. And he had a 3x5 card on every single person he photographed. And on that 3x5 card were the corresponding proof and negative of every single frame that person appeared on. So we had a Grateful Dead card, but he did not cross-reference. So what David and I had to do was cross-reference. So we had to look at Jefferson Airplane, we had to look at Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the Holding Company, Quicksilver, the Charlatans, those guys, and then we had to look at the venues they played at, which was the Fillmore, Winterland, Matrix, these places, and then events that they played at. So it was Herculean. It was a huge amount of information and photographs, but I think we whittled it down from over 10,000 images to about 260, black and white and color, and I think I really wanted to include the color because people really know Jim for his black and white, but they don't know the color. And so for us, it was important to include that color because it gives you a very different vibe and feel from black and white. And so to be able to see these two different kinds of images in black and white and colors, it's profound. And I think you get a sense of what it was like, and you can really see the fashion. The fashion was amazing back then. And in the vibrant color, you get a sense of that there were these oranges and reds.
Very little tie-dye in there, people.
Yeah, that's all came later.
Yeah. So that's my take. What do you take, David?
I was invited to participate in this project, and it was an instant yes, of course. And we did spend about a year. I'd go over once or twice a month and spend an afternoon with Amelia going through these images. and Dan Sullivan, our friend, was sort of our investigator. He would do the research to make sure that we knew the exact date and location of a given image and stuff. It was just so, it was just a joyous task, really. And what Amelia said about going through everything, it doesn't even take into account the little miracle. Like one day she was looking at a proof sheet of something else completely unrelated on another project, noticed that there was like this many images from one thing and then unrelated stuff at the bottom, took a closer look and found a single strip, like 6 images. Jim stopped by 710 Ashbury on his way home from shooting this Canadian band called Sparrow, and took a bunch of pictures of the Grateful Dead in the upstairs parlor of the house at 710 Ashbury, and she found it by accident. And it winds up being just a glorious part of this book. We put up one full-size image of it and then the strip down below so you could see the rest of it. I got to spend an amazing day on a Zoom with Carolyn Adams, Mountain Girl. She lives in Eugene. And after Amelia and I had made all of our selections, I put them all together and got on a Zoom with her. We went through all these images, and it was just one of the most amazing days of my life. My wife was in the next room listening to it going by, and we were both in tears at various times going through this. And that particular film strip, she looks at and goes, "Oh yeah, that's the upstairs parlor that was late in the afternoon because the sun always came in really strong at that time, right?" And then it's all of the members of the Grateful Dead before Mickey Hart joined. But it was clearly not a planned session because they're all just flopping around on chairs and stuff. And somebody's wearing a fireman's hat and Bobby's holding up this weird feathered headdress thing. Phil points a joint at Jim at one point during the thing. And there's a gun in the fucking picture. With red and white, with stripes on it. Mountain Girl sees this image, she goes, "Oh, that gun! Sunshine, go get the gun." She's in her house in Eugene. Her daughter, Sunshine, is there helping with this. She goes into another room and brings back the gun. It turns out it was a BB gun that Kesey had painted sometime back in the bus days and was still in the family. She still had it in the house. She said the thing, if you shot a BB out of it, it went about 10 feet and hit the ground. So it was not a weapon of any useful form. But as we can all discuss, the cognitive dissonance of a Grateful Dead guy holding up a gun. Yeah. That's another topic altogether. But it was just this miracle that came up in the course of Amelia doing this other work. And it wound up being this beautiful addition, sort of a little, extra lagniappe that rounded out this thing so beautifully.
Beautiful. Well, don't forget to check it out at intermission. I don't know if those books are unwrapped, but I think we could crack one open so that people can thumb through it. Jim, you haven't said anything yet, and I want to make sure we focus on you.
That's all right.
Your biography of Jerry Garcia is very thorough. Can you talk about like the early formations of this group, this musical sort of group of people? As I understand it, Jerry had somewhat of a leadership role at first. Did he have an idea of what he wanted to do with this group of people?
Yeah, the question of Jerry as leader is a running tension, I would say, throughout the book, and Dennis could certainly speak to this too. He very much resisted acting as the leader of the Grateful Dead, and yet I think for all practical purposes he was indisputably the leader of the Grateful Dead. And so when it came time to decide what's a Grateful Dead song, all eyes really turned to him to decide whether to weigh in on that. If you read the memoirs of the other members of the band, they're all about themselves and Jerry, right? I mean, their own place in the band, but also their relationship to him. So they clearly saw him as the center of their attention too. And I think that the band really reflects the music is an expression of his eclecticism. That the styles that we already have talked about of the jazz and the rock and roll and the folk music and the bluegrass is also a manifestation of his very eclectic musical palette. So I think in all those senses, it's correct to think of him as the leader of the band, even though if he were here, he would probably fight back against that.
And I want to interject here, because I think the most important thing Jim did in his book was make the case for Jerry Garcia's childhood as having formed his nature. And Dennis did great work on this topic as well, but Jim just focuses, and we have the benefit of 30 years of retrospect now, But what I got from your book really was that we learned what formed his nature, his personality, and why he wound up craving collaboration as much as he did.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that, and I would certainly those early years are really. He had a really rough childhood. He in the course of really just 1 year, his brother cut his middle finger off with an axe by accident, but not an auspicious start for a guitar player. His mother was a nurse. They tried to get him to the hospital and reconnect it, but they couldn't. And then, even more tragically, just a year later, on a camping and fishing trip with his mother and father, his father drowned. And Garcia, it's interesting, Garcia believed that he had actually witnessed the drowning. I think there's reason to believe that that's probably not true, but it certainly made a vast impression on him. And after his father died, his mother really couldn't handle him and his brother, so they went off to live with their grandparents. He had asthma. He had a really genuinely difficult upbringing, and I think, to your point, David, that is instrumental in understanding why he craved this other kind of family. And the Grateful Dead is very much self-styled as a family, and I don't think it's a coincidence that he's a person whose own family life was really shattered quite young. Oddly, it never did translate into him being a terribly responsible leader of his own nuclear family or families. He was not a conscientious husband or father, loved his daughters certainly, but was not present for much of it. So while he yearned for a kind of family, he didn't have much of a model in how to create that kind of family, at least in a traditional sense. So I think what you see is a real loyalty to his fellow musicians, a real sense of music as a kind of family expression, and the Grateful Dead community as an extended family. So I'll close with this. For me, all the more tragic that then at the end of his life, when drugs really did get the best of him, that one consequence of that was his isolation. As any of you who've dealt with addiction know, isolation is almost always a component of addiction. And so this person who had built this family structure, this community of musicians and others around him, became very isolated from it at the end. And so not only did he die young, but he was alone, I think, in a real sense, for someone who was so famous and so recognizable. He, at the same time, was quite isolated, and I find that a tragic final chapter of his life.
Let me have one other thing about leadership. There's this guy who just asked me to do an interview about Jerry as the reluctant CEO. And I said, okay. But here's the difference. Jerry was the leader, but it was a gravitational thing. He was the center of gravity, and as Jim said, you read all the memoirs, and they all talk about me and Jerry, my best friend Jerry, Mickey, who's working on his own autobiography. His memoir will come out, I don't know, soon, sometime. Same thing, and when you contrast that to, say, I always bring up George Harrison and Bill Wyman, right? The left out members, because Lennon and McCartney wrote the songs, and George might get one, and blah blah blah. Garcia literally pounded on Weir, who's very hard to pound on because he's on another planet, but to write songs. And demanded that he write songs on the principle that the Grateful Dead universe would be a much more interesting place with diversity. It was the reverse. So on that level, it's not like he didn't have an ego, but the kind of conventional values that demand that Mick Jagger's the guy out in front, and the star, and the mouth. he just, there was a wonderful sequence of 2 days where Stephen Stills sat in with the Grateful Dead in New Jersey. In the late 80s, 83, that early? And the first day they tried to do his song, and you know, it was the Grateful Dead, and no, I guess now I'm remembering it all wrong. I can't remember. Do you remember?
I know they did Love the One You're With one of those 2 days.
Right,
but
but
which the second day?
I think it was the same. I guess the first day
That
they
was a
tried to get
travesty.
yeah. Either way, you know, the point is that Stills wants to be a star, and Jerry would just go ahead. And it was not the conventional ego of a musician. I would just remember one of the most amazing things I ever saw was Branford Marsalis, who's a genius musician, coming on stage with the Grateful Dead, knowing not one note of any song. And they played a song, Bird Songs, which opens up into jamming. It's a first set song, and he played. And what he might have known, I certainly did, that it was essentially an audition, because at intermission, if it had not gone well, then it would have been, thanks for stopping by. Instead, Jerry's like standing there in love, and they're just, I mean, he sees the entire band is in love with him. I mean, you know, it was brilliant, and it was like, you can stay, can't you? And they went off into Dark Star in the next set, and it was that sense of collaboration, that desire to spread it out. I don't think it was ever better than that night, at least, you know, one of the great nights of their career.
There's one of the coolest things I think the Grateful Dead ever did was to resurrect long forgotten songs and dust them off and put them on stage. Anybody jump in about this? Who was the proponent of that, or was it sort of a group effort of discovery, or did someone say, "This is a weird song, let's try this"? You know.
Vince Welnick, who joined the band in 1990 after Brent Midland's untimely death, was a particularly wonderful avatar of that sort of thing. He had a great pop sensibility. He'd been with the Tubes for decades before he joined the Grateful Dead. So he'd come from a very different musical universe, but he had this great pop sensibility, and he brought Beatles songs into that world, and he got the Grateful Dead to do the Who, you know, Baba O'Reilly. But he also, one night Vince opened for the Jerry Garcia band. He put together a band called the Affordables, and opened for the Jerry Garcia band at the Oakland Coliseum, and they did a couple of Grateful Dead songs that had disappeared from the Grateful Dead's repertoire, The Golden Road and Here Comes Sunshine. And Jerry heard them. And then Vince tried to talk Jerry into bringing those songs back to the Grateful Dead. They had done Here Comes Sunshine like 20 times in 1973 and once in 74, and then it disappeared forever. But Jerry heard that, and Vince persuaded him to bring it back, and the Grateful Dead played it starting in 1992 and a few more times after that. He did not succeed in getting Jerry to bring back the Golden Road song. I wish it would have been fun if they had tried that. Interestingly, after Jerry's death, all of the other bands and all the surviving musicians have brought back all of those lost songs, including the complete Terrapin Suite and stuff like that. So Bobby does a bunch of songs that had disappeared from the Grateful Dead world. Because after Jerry, it was fair game. Everything could come back. But they again, I said earlier that the Grateful Dead's stock in trade was interpretation of other people's songs. They were folk musicians. They were part of the folk process. But I found sometimes they brought back songs. It was like, okay, Man Smart, Woman Smarter. Well, that's not a very interesting song musically. It filled up time nicely, and it was a great song to dance to. But I felt that it took up space that could have been occupied by something much more interesting and improvisational. But another very important line of demarcation in Grateful Dead history was when Mickey Hart came back to the Grateful Dead after his 3-year hiatus. The form of improvisation the Grateful Dead were doing before that moment was much more open and free form, and could abandon all sorts of key signature, time signature, and grooves and stuff. When Mickey Hart came back to the band and they started touring in 1976, it was much more groove oriented because there were two drummers. It was very hard to change things up. With just Bill Kreutzmann, who was fucking amazing, they could stop in the middle of something and go into something else just instantly. He was like tracking what everybody else was doing. But with two drummers in the band, and one of them being Mickey Hart, it was much more trance-oriented and more groove-oriented, and it was much harder to change direction. So the nature of Grateful Dead improvisation changed drastically at that time. And I felt, also, just another, I'll just bitch about this as well, that Bobby, when Bette Midland came into the band, he brought back a bunch of blues tunes that weren't terribly interesting and replaced his really interesting original songs with stuff like C.C. Ryder. I don't give a shit what Bob Weir has to say about C.C. Ryder. You know, and Walkin' Blues. Why, you know, I'm sorry, I'm griping. Many of you agree with me, I know. But he played Walkin' Blues when he could have played Black-Throated Wind, for God's sake. And why, you know, Robert Johnson settled the matter of Walkin' Blues way back then.
Let me tell you one example though. One revival. 1983, the Grateful Dead played for the first time in several years, St. Stephen. Very, very difficult song, very complex song, a song that really required them to pay attention. And the reason they did it was because Phil Lesh's brand new girlfriend, wife-to-be, Jill, this is 1983, so I think they just met, very close.
Their first date, weirdly enough, I know that their first date was February 17th, 1980.
Oh my God.
That is scary, I didn't know that.
I was hanging out socially with Phil at the time, so I just happened to know.
So
This is deep knowledge here.
So they're on the plane coming into New York, and she goes, "Why don't you please play St. Stephen?" And you know, she gets to Phil, and of course Phil then gets to the band, and then, oh, all right, we'll do that. And they rehearsed and played it at the Garden. This is Madison Square Garden, and it was quite good. It was a great moment. They played it again a week later, and they hadn't rehearsed it in the between, and it was meh. And then they came home and they had a show in San Francisco, in Marin, at Marin Vets. They were sticking a thumb into Bill Graham's eye by doing a show on their own, completely in the Bay Area, but completely without Bill Graham, which just made him crazy, which was the idea. And everybody, everybody, the Bay Area Deadheads were all doing you playing that song for the East Coast Deadheads, but you don't play it for us, and you know, you always do the more interesting things back there, which was true because they, among other things, they had like 10 shows, and they would be warmed up, and then, okay, when they're really on top of their game, they can do something goofy. Not at home, you know, that was usually the first show, you know, it was kind of warm-ups basically for tours. But they get nagged and nagged and nagged, and they played the worst version of St. Stephen ever recorded. And I don't think they ever played it again. I hope not. God knows, I hope it wasn't the same as it was at Marin Vets, because it was awful.
They took a rather unfortunate stab at the Beatles' Revolution a couple times.
Yeah.
Too.
Oh, this is so good. Deep. So, Dennis, how many years were you the publicist for the Dead?
For the Grateful Dead, I was the publicist from 1984 to 1995, and I mean it stopped being the Grateful Dead when Jerry died. But I stayed the publicist for the production company until '04 when it folded, and then with Bobby for another 4 years. A
Okay.
total of about 20 years. Roughly.
Okay. What were they like as employers?
Fabulous. You know, Phil and Billy didn't do interviews, so they could care less what I did. Bobby occasionally did an interview, depending on that. Mickey had many side projects, not so much when I started, but as time went on. where he'd do his drum books and all this stuff. And so, he loved loved working in publicity. Obviously, the main person that people wanted was Jerry, and Jerry was the perfect boss because he assumed that I knew what I was doing, which was generous, at least at the beginning. On the other hand, being a publicist is not what you call rocket science, and I had the basics down. And he thought if I thought it was important or interesting, we did interviews with like Jeff, what was his name? Oh, the guy at ABC. It doesn't matter. But anyway, it was like a very interesting national.
Greenfield?
Greenfield, thank
Jeff
you.
Greenfield.
Jeff Greenfield, and we did that. That was a classic screw up since what happened, I was told, I don't know if this is true, was we did the interview, which went very well, and deadheads, supposedly some deadheads learned about this, got his home phone number, and called him up to say, when are you gonna put it on? And he freaked out and buried the story. The morning after Jerry died, I got up at 4 in the morning and went to, I think it was KTVU. No, it was the NBC station, Kron, next to the Jack, for those of you old enough to remember the Jack Tar Hotel, where's now Kaiser, the big new hospital. To do an interview with Jeff Greenfield, and I wasn't gonna say, you motherfucker, you owe me. And he going, yeah, Dennis, it's great, I found that material. I was going, oh gee, that's wonderful, Jeff. But at any rate, and we did an interview with, I'm gonna pull a blank again, the desk clerk in The Graduate.
Buck Henry.
Buck Henry. So we did it. Thank you. So
Takes the village.
I get a phone call. This was another one that was like, why did I go through all this? Because I got this interview, oh, Buck Henry wants to interview Jerry. Jerry, I'd love to talk to Buck Henry. Well, why not? So they do like a half an hour, 45 minutes. It was at Shoreline and backstage. All great. No, it was in Sacramento. But anyway. And that was fine, and the interview, the material, when it came out, it was like a minute and a half on the air, and I was like, what? The life of a publicist.
That's the nature of television.
Oh yeah, all the above.
I mean,
Wow. But as employers, they treated you well? You always got paid?
I always got paid, after Brett died, and I coped with it, in a way that frankly concealed how he died for the initial report, because frankly I didn't think it was any of their business, and the band appreciated that since they've had enough grief in their lives, and so I got a huge raise, as a matter of fact. It's the only raise I ever got. Well, no, pardon me, the company got raises regularly. I mean, I was being pretty well paid by that point. But then I sort of went up to almost getting paid as much as the crew, which in that band was like status. The band, and it wasn't the band, it was Jerry. I say this because Jerry and Hunter were the conscience of the band. And things that really bother me now, without going into big detail, about the current management of Den Company, which is, it's conventional. It's, they charge what the market will bear, for instance. Well, that's not the way the Grateful Dead was.
$6,346 for the 3-day Golden Road Super VIP package.
Exactly. And so forth. $200 to stand on the field the band allows that. Don't ask. That's what they have decided to do in their age. One story about working for the Grateful Dead, and he puts it way better than I ever could. We just finished a day of loading in at RFK Stadium. So if you're at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C., it means it's summer, stadium shows. It means it's disgusting. It's 100 degrees, it's 100 degrees, and it's like 95% humidity, and it is just horrible. And it almost killed Jerry, you know, with dehydration that sent him into a diabetic coma. This is some other year. And I happened to get to the top of the stage stairs. We were going back to the hotel in a van. And we get to the top of the stairs, and Ramrod, who is the other heart of the Grateful Dead, and a guy you don't know much about, and some other time we'll tell Ramrod stories, but a mensch and an important person. And he gets to the top of the stairs, and it was not what you call, he didn't read, he didn't, you know, he wasn't, no intellectual, but solid human being. And we get to the top of the stairs, and he sort of shrugs. And like I say, I mean, it's 12 hours of this. And he goes, well, at least it's not a real job. You can parse that. I could discuss that for like half an hour. I mean, it's really quite profound, and it really is spot on, and it's true. I mean, whatever we did, and sometimes I worked, I mean, you know, ridiculous hours, and I mean, I took 70, 80 calls a day when we were home, and then we'd go out on the road, and I'd be working 12 hours. None of that's to complain, by the way. But just to say, it wasn't a real job. It was working for the Grateful Dead. And, you know.
Yeah. Wow. Go ahead, Jim.
Just one little thing just about, not that I worked for the Dead, which I didn't, but one of the great document finds for me in my research is the meeting minutes of the Grateful Dead board that would meet quarterly.
Do tell.
Because the Grateful Dead's a corporation, right? And so it had regular meetings. And the minutes really do capture, I think, just what Dennis is saying is there'll be an agenda. You know, first item will be, you know, picking a warm-up act for the coming tour, or ticket prices, or that setting up a taper section. But then there'll be items of, you know, so and so on the crew is going through a divorce and needs a raise or needs some money. Or there is a hominess and a caring that comes through these fairly unusual board meeting minutes. So I just really want to echo, I think, what Dennis is saying, which is that there is a humanity about the organization that even comes through in the meeting minutes.
So that's how I got my job.
Yeah. I only have time for a couple more questions. I just want to make sure that we get Jim to talk a bit more, and then a few more points. And I think Gabby is coming up as soon. So maybe all of it, yeah. We can all talk about the duality in this group of people of lawless and lovable. Like, I know, I've seen the DEA documents. They would track the Grateful Dead tour and bust deadheads all around the United States. And yet, at the same time, they were invited to the White House. So somehow they brainwashed America into thinking both things are cool, or like that's you know, both things can be true.
Well, they are, aren't they?
They are.
Yeah, but I want these guys to talk about it, not you.
He was there, but go ahead.
No, he was there too, but he doesn't have a microphone, so.
I got him on mic. It's at the White House.
Yeah, well, I wrote the story for the LA Times about the DEA's monitoring of the Grateful Dead, actually, so I have one of my footnotes in the book is to my own story in the LA Times. Yeah, they were, well, first of all, I would say the DEA that surveilled the Dead and Dead shows is not the same administration that invited them to the White House, right? So there are some changes there. But yeah, I think Bob's exactly right. That they are both things at once. They are both romantic and exciting and representative or emblematic of a kind of culture. And that culture is scary to some people and objectionable to some people. So it is, I mean, you know, the subtext of my book is the counterculture, right? That's very much what that is that is this culture in opposition to a certain culture that is also very attractive. And so those things are definitely both true at the same time.
Jim published an op-ed a couple months ago in the New York Times that talked about Jerry's relationship to the law and stuff like that. And I make the point here, tell me,
Yeah.
because I thought you sketched that out really
I
nicely
appreciate
for
that.
how to ignore all that
I
shit.
mean, yeah, there's a lot to think about with respect to the Grateful Dead and Jerry Garcia and their politics, and that's a longer conversation that we can have. But to this specific point, excuse me, you know, I think in some ways Garcia really didn't see the law as binding him. That there was that he liked to say, you know, most of what goes on in politics doesn't really affect people. And there's a real radical idea buried in that, a kind of an anarchism, really.
Absolutely.
But it is a refusal to submit to government authority at a certain level, and that's not what we genuinely, when we talk about politics, we talk about candidates and fundraising and advertising, and that's my day job, really. But there is another way to think about politics, which is about values. And in that sense, he is a political figure. He is a person who lived a set of values that other people could emulate, that those values are threatening to a certain class, and who refused to accept the government's right to control his thinking or his creative expression. To me, that is a political life. It is not a political life of candidates and campaigns, but it is about holding and expressing values, whether the government wants you to or not.
I might add that he refused to vote.
Oh, right.
And we had a great argument about that. I lost.
Well, that brings me to the last question I have is, we live in a very, very bizarre time politically now in this United States. And I don't want people to walk away from this event thinking, oh, that was some cool hippie history from back in the day. I want to know that the values of the Grateful Dead are still alive and they can be applied to this administration. And we still, should remember them and use them in our everyday lives.
Okay.
Many of us do, Jack.
Okay, thank you, good night.
Yeah. Well, listen, there are a lot of things to say about counterculture and its relevance today. And the counterculture is a lot of different things. It's a hard thing to write about, I can testify to that, because it is sort of inchoate, right? It's in the arts, it's in music, it's in politics. One thing, though, that is true about the counterculture then and now is that it exists out of opposition, that's why it is counter, to a prevailing set of values in politics. The sobering thing, I think, to realize about the counterculture of the 60s and 70s is that it took a long time for those values to ascend. It took the Reagan years, the Nixon years, there's a lot of struggle. The Vietnam War went on for many, many years after the counterculture tried to bring it to an end. So that it's sobering to realize it doesn't happen quickly. But I guess the thing I would say about our current morass, Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, great foes of the counterculture, were genuinely popular figures. Richard Nixon in 1972 was elected with more than 60% of the popular vote. He carried every electoral vote except those of Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. That's a wipeout. That was a landslide election. Stolen in some ways, but a landslide election. Reagan, similarly, both elections, convincing elections. Donald Trump has never carried a majority in any election that he ran in. His coalition is much more fragile than those that Nixon and Reagan presided over. So the counterculture today may still be coalescing, but its opposition is much weaker than the counterculture of the 60s and 70s confronted. So I hope there's some heart to take out of that. I think the values that we associate with the Grateful Dead, freedom, creativity, kindness, community, those are eternal values. They didn't end in the 1970s. They matter. Love. Oh yeah, there's many more. I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to give a full list. But they matter. They matter maybe more than ever, and they have the chance of prevailing now because the opposition to them, I think, is different than the one that they once confronted. So I hope that there's some hope to take them.
Can I just add one thing about
Absolutely.
But also in the photography world, where everything is digital and people have their cell phones and things, I think it's very, very important to show reality through photographs. Use your camera as a way to show what is happening as a reality, because photographs can speak volumes with no words. And you cannot, I think photojournalists of today really need to look back and show that the photographs were taken in the 60s that Jim and other photographers took. They matter, and they can make a difference, and we can gain strength from looking at our past and seeing what worked, and we can do peaceful protesting, and we can do those things, and that is very real, and that is something that that's a tool that we can use today to make a difference.
Sure.
So I think we need to keep
To that point, so much, the George Floyd and all that, because everybody has a camera, and a video camera at that, ICE, whatever, one list, because of the widespread use of cameras, there's a way for people to believe what they're told because they see it,
Right.
rather than, well, we think they beat him up, but.
Right.
So,
Right,
anyway,
right. Photographic proof.
more important than ever.
Yeah.
Right. Gabby, do you want to come up now? Okay, so just very briefly, she's going to talk a little bit about her book, and then we're going to take an intermission, and then there's some special treats. So Gabby Moskowitz is the author of several cookbooks and the founder of BrokeAssGourmet.com, an award-winning website, about inexpensive gourmet cooking. Her newest release just came out today. Tuesday is called Dead in the Kitchen, the official Grateful Dead cookbook. And she lives in Marin County, and she brought some extra special treats with her tonight. So here's Gabby. Please welcome Gabby.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be in the presence of you guys. Dead in the Kitchen is the official Grateful Dead cookbook. I worked really closely with Dave Lemieux of Dave's Picks. If you are familiar with Dave's Picks, you'll recognize what he did here at the end of the book. He did Dave's Picks of the recipes. We organized it to flow like a dead show. So you open up the lot with fatty egg rolls. Some of these things will look familiar. I should mention there's a strict license that Rhino and Warner Music imposes, so we couldn't call them Jerry rolls. But 3 different kinds of grilled cheese, multiple kind veggie burritos, and a lot more. So a lot of it, there's a chapter that's inspired by foods you would see on Shakedown Street, but then they wanted it to be a vegetarian with, and I should say every recipe is vegan possible, cookbook. And the recipes sort of ramp up the way that a dead show does. So after you hit the lot, you go to the dressing room, and that's where all your sauces are. And then from there, tuning. First, there's opening act, and that is appetizers. Tuning up is soups and salads, and that's to kind of get you a little taste of what's to come, but not an amuse-bouche of the rest of the night, as it were. First act or first set. These are your weeknight, quick, straightforward, easy dinners. About 2/3 of the way through the book, we have a riff break. And that is one of my proudest accomplishments. These are improvisational recipes. So for each one, you start with something. Like here, you start with a tray of potatoes, and then these are all your riffs that you can make. You start with one simple ingredient. You start with a pot of rice and all the stuff you can do with rice, and it's very, Jerry, I couldn't find the exact quote, but has spoken about how in order to improvise really well, you have to be incredibly organized. And that is also true in the kitchen. When you have a really well-stocked pantry, you can riff on whatever you've got. So after Riff Break, second set, these are your more complex, involved, a little bit longer recipes that are maybe for kind of a more special night. Encore would be the dessert chapter. and then it's the end of the show and then some other stuff at the end. But one thing that's really cool is Molly Katzen from Moosewood wrote forward. And when I called her to ask if she would contribute a forward, because the recipes are kind of an homage to the vegetarianism, health food movement that came out of the 60s and 70s and was absolutely spread throughout the United States and beyond, with help from deadheads, going to dead shows and cooking curries on camping stoves in parking lots and finding out about tofu and taking it back to where they live. So when I called Molly to ask if she would do it, she said, you know, it's funny, before I opened Moosewood, when I was in my early 20s, I was living in San Francisco working as a chef and used to cater for Jerry Garcia. It was meant to be. It was so much fun to work on. It was really a dream project. So thank you for having me. And I have some snacks from the book out in the bar area. There is a curried pumpkin pizza that has cheddar and kind of like a slug green chutney, and then pickled onions and sesame seeds, and then also some brown butter spelt chocolate chip cookies with walnuts.
Gabby Moskowitz, everybody.